Hello. This lecture is called Making Sense of Mao. My name is Timothy Cheek, and I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia. I will speak to you today about making sense of Mao. I want to begin with three stories, three short quotes about Mao, because most of us come to know Mao through someone else's report. Here's the first one. I think my first impression, dominantly one of native shrewdness, was probably correct. And yet, Mao was an accomplished scholar of classical Chinese, an omnivorous reader, a deep student of philosophy and history, a good speaker, a man with an unusual memory and extraordinary powers of concentration, an able writer, careless in his personal habits and appearance, but astonishingly meticulous about details of duty, a man of tireless energy and military and political strategist of considerable genius. And here's the second story, or vignette. Psychologists of mass behavior might have an explanation for what went wrong in China in late summer of 1958. China was struck with a mass hysteria fed by Mao, who then fell victim himself. Mao's earlier skepticism had vanished. Common sense escaped him. He acted as though he believed the outrageous figures for agricultural production. The excitement was contagious. I was infected too. And finally, a third view. It's actually a ditty, a little street poem, and in English runs like this. Beijing relies on the center, Shanghai on its connections. Guangzhou leans on Hong Kong. The drifting population lives by Mao Zedong thought. These three quotes come from 1937, the first one. 36 was when Edgar Snow interviewed Mao Zedong in the Shanxi province in northwest China. The second comes from one of Mao's doctors, Zhisul, whose book called The Private Life of Chairman Mao was published in English in 1994. And the third is the ditty that was popular on the streets of China in the 1990s amongst the drifting population, the working poor. These three views of Mao are only three, but they represent the range of views of Mao Zedong, leader of the Chinese Communist Party and the founder of the People's Republic of China. Edgar Snow was impressed with him, as many others have been. Zhisul was dismayed and disappointed by him, as many others have been as well. And the working poor continue to think about what he had to say that makes sense in China today. This video lecture will follow three major topics. Why study Mao? Mao in history, and the many faces of Mao in contemporary China. Why study Mao? There are three good reasons for studying Mao Zedong. It is possible to study him as a window on China's 20th century history. Born in the late 19th century and dying in 1976, his life and career spans most of the 20th century. He was first a participant, then a leader, and then the supreme leader and chairman of the Chinese Revolution. By looking at Mao and Mao's life at different times, we can get one window into the experience of China's 20th century revolutions. Second, we can study Mao as one way to find out what he means in reformed China today. He is still the founding leader of the People's Republic of China. He is still honored by the Chinese Communist Party, and his works still form the official ideology of the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China. So if we look at what people think about Mao today, we'll get one way to find out what life is like in China today and what's important about this revolutionary leader who did so much, both good and bad, for China. And finally, it's worth studying Mao as an example of a great leader in the 20th century. The question, of course, is, as the quote suggested, is he a hero, a demon, or something else? Mao in history. It's useful to look at Mao and his life in three periods to get a sense of how he relates to broader Chinese history and to use Mao as a window into 20th century history. The three periods can be summarized by their character, and they are Mao as a head of his colleagues. When as a young revolutionary, he suggested that the Chinese Communist Party should work in the countryside rather than in the cities. Since the Chinese Communist Party in the 1920s was a Leninist party, it was following the leadership of the Soviet Communist Party based in Moscow, and therefore, in accordance with Marxism and Leninism, focused on the urban working class, the proletariat. Mao, for various reasons, took an interest in the peasantry and in the countryside. At first, that was not a popular view of the Communist Party, but it came to be a popular view. The text that is most famous for Mao in this period is his report in 1927 on the Hunan peasant uprising. There he glorified in the violence of rural insurrection. That long article is important for two things. One, it was a sound, a cry, that the Chinese Revolution would have to deal with the countryside despite the niceties of a Marxist-Leninist creed, which would have the party focus on the cities. And second, Mao's work there was actually reasonably rigorous. He lived in the area originally, came back in 1926, and did field research. The original version of this long essay includes charts and tables of data about peasant organizations. He did his homework in this case. Mao, however, was ahead of his colleagues. The party leadership believed in urban revolution, and it was working with the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party. Indeed, Mao wrote the Hunan peasant report on the Hunan peasant uprising as a leading member of the Nationalist Party himself, as well as also being a communist. In the broader history, which this lecture does not cover, the Communist Party split from the Nationalists in 1927 and was in fact purged and attacked, and the remnants of the party regrouped in the countryside. At this point, Mao's ideas about rural revolution made a lot more sense to his colleagues. Mao became a leader of a regional branch of the Chinese Communist Party in southeast China in the Jiangxi Soviet, which is in the province of Jiangxi. There, Mao gained some experience and developed rural mass mobilization. But it was not without mistakes, and his leadership was both contested and revoked. By 1934, he had been fired from several of his jobs and was not a leader even in the regional area. However, through the disasters of the encirclement campaigns, which crushed the communist movement in Southeast China, and the Long March, which is remembered heroically, but at the time was nothing short of a retreat, the military policies of his colleagues who had replaced him turned out not to work. Mao's ideas about guerrilla warfare, mobile warfare, seemed to work. And starting in 1935, he began his return to power. He did not complete his return to power until the 1940s. But by the 1940s, in the period that is widely known as the Yan'an period, because of the county town in Shanxi province in the northwest of China, where the Communist Party of China was based from essentially 1936 to 1947, Mao did rise to become supreme leader with a series of policies that appeared to work. They managed to deal with military issues, economic issues, and political leadership issues. This is remembered as a glorious time in the history of Mao's life and in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. It does not mean it was a perfect time. However, the Communist Party managed to pull itself together and to fight Japanese, take care of the villages under its control, and build an army that behaved much better than the other Chinese armies of the day. Particularly in the rectification movement of 1942 to 1944, Mao came forward as the top leader of the party and articulated a program that catapulted the Chinese Communist Party to national leadership. The various policies and ideas that he put forward are at the heart of what is currently called Mao Zedong thought, and have to do with issues of mass lying, of populist policy, Leninist organization of the party, and a series of policies that were aimed to make the Communist Party effective as local administrators and effective as leaders of the Chinese army, or the Communist army called the People's Liberation Army. With these policies, the Chinese Communist parties came to national leadership in 1949. Mao gained unimaginable authority and influence based on this stunning success. As he stood in Tiananmen on October 1st, 1949, so many of his colleagues recalled, "We couldn't believe we were there. We couldn't believe this would ever have happened. It was a dream come true." Ever after, his colleagues and the majority of the population in China believed what Chairman Mao said must be right. He had made the unimaginable hope come true. This brings us into the third period of Mao's life, where he became increasingly out of touch with his colleagues. This supreme leadership position essentially brought out the worst. You can always think of Lord Acton's dictum, "Power tends to corrupt, absolute power corrupts absolutely," and Mao can be seen as an example of this truth. Particularly after 1956, Mao came out with a series of radical programs that increasingly did not work. The 100 Flowers program that was meant to be a rectification, just like the one in Yan'an, but more public, started out with great promise and ended up in a terrible purge of intellectuals known as the Anti-Rightist Campaign. This was followed immediately by a very ambitious economic program called the Great Leap Forward that resulted in probably the single greatest disaster of 20th century China's history, which is the massive famine of 1958 to 1961, which is 100% the fault of Mao Zedong. Without Mao Zedong, it would not have happened. Upwards of 20 million to 30 million rural Chinese starved to death because of the ill-formed policies that Mao forced upon his colleagues, and which his colleagues, based on his tremendous success in 1949, obeyed despite their own self-doubts. After a period of reform and retrenchment in the early 1960s, Mao came back with the last of his utopian schemes, the Cultural Revolution, and the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. I won't review the details of the Cultural Revolution now. There are many other studies to do with that, but it went badly wrong. And it was chaotic, and it caused a great deal of suffering. So those policies by Mao, beginning in 1956, are examples of him being out of touch with his colleagues, being beyond his colleagues. And these three periods of Mao's life, these three roles that Mao played, give us at least a broad handle to understand Mao in history. He was not always the same thing. He was ahead of his colleagues in the 1920s and 30s. He was the successful unifying leader of his colleagues in the 1940s and 50s. And he was the dangerously erratic supreme leader out of control of his colleagues in the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s until his death in 1976. The second part of Mao in history concerns Western views of Mao, since the views you have of Mao are unlikely to have come directly from reading Chinese, but from materials written in English. And I've selected a half dozen representative voices to get a sense of the diversity of views held in English language writing about Mao Zedong from 1936 to 2005. The first is the view of Edgar Snow, and that was the first long quote that I gave you at the beginning of this lecture. Edgar Snow was an intrepid American populist journalist active in China in the 1930s. This was the scoop of his life. Very few Westerners had gotten out towards where the communists were. He was just about the first, and certainly the first American, to get to see the communist leadership in Yan'an and Bao'an nearby in 1936. Edgar Snow was responsible for solidifying the view of Mao Zedong and the communists as national populists rather than Reds. He downplayed the ideology and played up the clean living, the honest work, and the hard fighting of the communist armies. In truth, both were true. They were relatively functional armies, and they were hard-working leadership, but they were also committed communists. They believed in Marxism-Leninism, and they believed that only through the Bolshevik Party of the Leninist Party could they liberate China. It's important to remember two things. That the presentation that Edgar Snow gave of Mao Zedong was idealized. And we can see the famous photograph of Mao from Edgar Snow's book, which is known to many. He looks, as Snow said, as a Lincoln-esque figure. Such a metaphor was powerful. But as for the ideology and the Bolshevism of the communists, he underplayed that, and it was true and it was real. But the second important thing about this and Edgar Snow's view is the Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party, were also a Bolshevik-Leninist party. And Chiang Kai-shek was being promoted in the 1930s and 40s as the supreme ideological leader of China. These are two Leninist parties fighting for control, not a fight between a communist group and a democratic group. The second picture to emphasize is that given by Benjamin Schwartz in 1951. By that time, the Cold War was on full tilt, and the assumption of Westerners was that Mao was a puppet of Stalin, that the Chinese Communist Party was a branch, a franchised branch of the Moscow Communist Center. The importance of Benjamin Schwartz's 1951 book on Mao Zedong was that it introduced Mao to the reading public with the benefits of scholarship. And he made clear, by reference to documents, Benjamin Schwartz did, that Mao was not a puppet of Moscow, that he was an independent but fully communist thinker and revolutionary. So Benjamin Schwartz established in the Western mind that Mao was a different kind of communist, and that the Chinese Communist Revolution was its own sort of communist revolution. The next voice is that of Stuart Schram. In 1966, his biography of Mao became an instant bestseller and is the most powerful and enduring biography of Mao of the many written in English. Schram is known as the chief scholar of Mao studies in the West. He is now in his 80s and still active, and he started publishing in the early 1960s. He translated pretty much everything Mao published before 1949 and many other documents as well, and has analyzed Mao's writings. Schram established Mao in the Western mind as a serious political thinker. Schram engaged Mao's writings on a scholarly level, with a strong knowledge of Russian and Soviet background that Schram had, and also writing often in French, meaning that Stuart Schram was fully engaged with European scholarship and not only Anglo-American scholarship. Over the years, in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, Schram has given careful analysis of various stages of Mao's thought and politics. Finally, his great project, beginning in the 1990s, is a 10-volume complete translation of Mao's writings up until 1949. Our fourth set of example scholars are the biographies at the end of the century of Mao Zedong, one by Jonathan Spence and one by Philip Short. They reflect a scholarly consensus at the end of the century trying to make sense of the historical Mao. Spence's book is ideal for most classes because it is short and well written. He is selective in the events and material that he covers, but he does so with his well-known, excellent narrative style and his even-handed and humane approach to his topics. Mao does not come out as either a hero or a demon, but a complex character who is rooted in his time and place. Particularly outstanding for those of us raised on the earlier revolutionary Mao Zedong as Mao, the peasant leader, Schram emphasized in his short English biography what earlier Chinese biographies had made clear in the 1980s and 90s, and that is that Mao was not a peasant in the simple sense. Rather, he was a rich peasant, or from a rich peasant family, or that is to say, a well-to-do rural family. He never did much farming. But he ran a revolutionary bookstore. He was a radical son of a prosperous family. Philip Short, on the other hand, in the same year, published a long and detailed and readable account full of details of Mao's life, and his sex life, and his ups and his downs, done in, I think, a quite balanced fashion, what I call the intelligent journalist tradition of British journalism, a 500-page book, based on the best scholarship, but also on his own readings and his own efforts. So, for a sense of what scholars thought of Mao at the end of the 20th century, Spence gives a good short view, and Short gives a complete view. Finally, two books that come into English from Chinese and represent a very important development in the making sense of Mao, both in China and in the West. And these are two memoir-oriented texts. One is officially a memoir, the memoirs of Mao's doctor, or at least one of Mao's doctors, Zhisul, which came out in 1994, and Rongjiang's or Chang's and John Halliday's biography of Mao in 2005. Both texts, as we heard from the quote from Zhisul concerning 1958, both of these texts are critical of Mao, and they're written by Chinese who were alive under Mao's time. Zhisul was one of his doctors in 1958. Zhang was a Red Guard teenager during the Cultural Revolution. These two books are important for the detail they bring to bear, but more important, I think, because they turn out both to have problems in their source materials, and not everything they say is reliable. And serious scholars will want to read the many reviews by scholars of both Zhisul and John Halliday's books to get a sense of what is considered reliable or unreliable in these books. But one thing is certain about these books. They reflect a sea change in the view of Mao, both in China and in the West. It is possible to criticize the supreme leader. It is possible to point out his errors. And it is possible to challenge his memory and demand that he stand accountable for the crimes he committed and the crimes that were committed in his name. Not that these books are successful in answering those charges, but they certainly reflect a generational interest to question that was not shown in the earlier works. Now let's turn to the third section of this lecture, the many faces of Mao in contemporary China. Since this lecture's theme is making sense of Mao, I think that it's worth to spend most of our time on the meanings that Mao has in China today. I'll emphasize 5 different areas, but all of them relate to one shared issue, and that is Mao is still an important part of Chinese identity and Chinese nationalism. And in a way, I'll go from the top and the big to the small and the personal. That is, from Mao as political platform, to Mao among the scholars, to what we call interest group Mao, Mao used by workers, farmers, or others. And then pop Mao, Mao on the street, Mao on the internet, commercial Mao, folk religion uses. And finally, personal Mao, individual memories of what Mao meant. In China today, there is no longer a single view on just about anything. In Chinese, it's called 多元化, pluralization. And that generally refers to an opening of the political realm and the loosening of political controls. But it means not one voice. It means multiple voice, or pluralization. And so these visions of Mao, these uses of Mao in contemporary China are a reflection of that pluralization. Mao as political platform. Mao Zedong thought is still the official ideology of the Chinese Communist Party and therefore of the People's Republic of China. Unlike the Soviet Union, there has not been a de-Stalinization or a retreat of the Communist Party in name or in fact. There has been no official reckoning of Mao. Something close to it happened in 1981, called the Historical Resolution on Some Questions in Our Party's History, where the Central Committee of the Communist Party ruled on the justifications or not of cultural revolutions, and famously decided that Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong. And the point there was, get over it, move forward. No fundamental critique of Mao is allowed in public language in China today. That is because Mao Zedong, Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought is the official ideology. It is the justification for the rule of the Chinese Communist Party in the absence of popular elections. To dismiss Mao, to say that it was all wrong, would be to dismiss the reasons why the party feels that it has the right to rule. They also feel that the policy platforms in Mao's thought are practical, and it is not simply the case that they're not practical. Many aspects are. In any event, anyone who's working in the public arena in China has to work in reference to, or within the bounds of, Mao Zedong thought. A very big change since the Cultural Revolution and since the early 1980s is that people no longer need to quote Mao. They can ignore Mao, and most people do. But in terms of politics, you cannot just dismiss Mao. And in fact, we will see that in public debates, people frequently choose to resort to quoting Mao for very different arguments. Like any leader who wrote a lot, Mao said different things at different times. And you can find a Mao quote to support many different incompatible public policies in China today, and people do. First and foremost, Mao Zedong thought is part of the political platform of the leading government officials. It's the political platform of the Chinese Communist Party. It has been enriched, as they like to say, by the three represents of Jiang Zemin, General Secretary until a few years ago, or Harmonious Society, Hu Jintao. All of these are additions to Mao's thought rather than rejections of Mao's thought, but they are pretty substantial revisions. They include welcoming capitalists into the Chinese Communist Party. They include a rejection of class struggle. And they include a warm embrace and celebration of the intellectual elite. These are three topics that Mao Zedong did not necessarily personally embrace most of the time. And yet, there's enough flexibility and different statements that Mao made, allowing the party to do this. What is the point of Mao as political platform? Is it all just a smokescreen? I don't think so. If we look at the policy pronouncements that the Communist Party makes, we can understand the shift in actual governance. The three represents, widely believed as silly silly propaganda by intellectuals inside of China and out actually articulates important moves in the Chinese government since 1995 to welcome businessmen and the market economy, to welcome open intellectual exchange and connections with the world, and to stop having mass campaigns and class struggle. Given that the Communist Party has not made a rejection of Mao, as in the Soviets did with de-Stalinization, they cannot do it any other way. Change has to be cast as a reinterpretation of Mao rather than a rejection of Mao. Second, Mao among the scholars. Scholars used to have to quote Mao pretty much all the time. At the beginning of their articles, at the end of their articles, and how Mao Zedong thought helped them to make better physics theory, or better mathematics, or better historical research. Scholars no longer have to do that. However, many choose to refer to Mao because of his continuing authority as the representative of what's good for China. So, even scholars who are arguing for liberalism, political liberalism, or changes in political structure, will quote Mao, particularly from the 1940s, when in Yan'an he was trying to work with a coalition government. And so he said many reasonable things. Others, known as the New Left, or critical intellectuals, used more radical writings of Mao to challenge the current government for its failure to take care of China's poor and dispossessed. So scholars will cite Mao for alternate policies, and what I'm interested in pointing out is that they still bother to invoke his name. There seems to be something there that intellectuals find relevant. In addition, there is, of course, establishment scholars in the Communist Party itself, which study Mao a bit like theology. They are in charge of the scholastic theory studies of Mao for the Communist Party. But those are not widely read by ordinary folks. In between the Mao amongst the scholars and popular Mao are the many, many books, biographies, and especially reminiscences about Mao that are reasonably popular and include scurrilous details of his personal life. And so there are reminiscences from his senior secretaries, the men who worked as his assistants. There are reminiscences from his bodyguards, from his doctor, from people who were close to his family, from people who worked in offices near to him in Zhongnanhai, the center of Beijing, all the way down to his dance partners and his nurses. You can find as much information about the personal Mao as you have time to consume. I want to turn to interest group Mao now. This is the use of Mao by different social groups in China today. And I want to begin with a particular example. China's workers and farmers are increasingly outspoken as the social consequences of reform create winners and losers in the 1990s and into the 2000s. In the fight over resources that deregulation, privatization, and uncoordinated development have created, farmers, workers, and urban residents have protested and struck back. In such resistance, they often invoke Mao's ideas and image to support their claims. Jin Guangli gives a notable example from the northeastern province of Liaoning, in China's state-owned industry Rust Belt. In March of 2002, some 30,000 workers from a score of factories marched in the streets carrying a huge poster of Mao Zedong. One of the participants told me, there were people singing the Internationale. An elderly woman worker cried out, lamenting, Chairman Mao should not have died so soon. There was a huge portrait of Mao that an elderly worker took from his home, a personal collector's item. We actually had a planning meeting beforehand and decided that we should take a Mao portrait with us because we wanted to show the contrast we felt between the past and the present. I think this is a vivid example of a heartfelt use of Mao. These workers are using Mao because they believe that something in what he said and what he did was good and was important in their lives and should, frankly, shame the current leadership. What were they protesting? They were protesting layoffs, and they were protesting that the new leadership in their locality had cut their pensions. There are hundreds of other examples of interest group Maos, of farmers, of workers, of environmental activists, invoking not only Mao's ideas, but his image in order to shame their local leaders and also to protect themselves. Quite simply, when you're having a public march and you have a huge poster of Mao in front of you, they can't shoot you with a water cannon, because you can't shoot a water cannon at the image of Mao Zedong. Pop Mao. Our fourth category for the many faces of Mao is probably one of the largest in volume, because it covers the uses of Mao on the street amongst the working poor, on the net amongst the 100 million or so young, mostly young Chinese on the internet, the commercial or commodified uses of Mao as an image on handbags and sunglasses and cigarette lighters, and finally, the use of Mao in folk religion. In all these aspects, we see uses of Mao that are uncontrolled and undirected by the state or by any coherent group. These uses of Mao are not necessarily in line with party platform or scholarly understandings of Mao. And they are not as organized as worker or farmer or residential groups using Mao to make a focused political point. They reflect the continued significance of Mao in very different ways. The simplest one is the commodified Mao. They have Mao on a handbag or Mao on a clock. There, Mao is just a celebrity. And some of the young people using Mao don't particularly know that much about him at this point. These uses of Mao on the internet relate to the ideas and propositions that Mao himself put forward. Most powerfully, however, are the street uses of Mao, represented in the third quote that we began this lecture with, the ditty. The party center Beijing relies on the center, Shanghai on its connections, Guangzhou leans on Hong Kong, and the drifting population relies on Mao Zedong thought. This little ditty, like all sarcastic ditties, points to the true power sources. The Beijing national capital, like all national capitals, relies on the central government purposes. Shanghai is the major development center and famous for its banking, and it's always connections amongst the elites. Guangzhou, or otherwise known as Canton, next to Hong Kong, is getting its industrial development by leaning on the example of Hong Kong. And the floating population, the 150 million and more working poor who do the building trades and the dirty work for China's growing cities, the point there in the ditty is the only person who cares about them. Beijing doesn't care, Shanghai doesn't care, Guangzhou doesn't care, the party elite doesn't care, business elite doesn't care, industrial elite doesn't care, only Mao Zedong, only Chairman Mao. Whether this is true or not, that it's invoked is important. That the ideas of Mao are still remembered as legitimating the reasonable requests of the working poor for subsistence. The final popular use of Mao is not in accord with what Mao did most of his life, and that is treating Mao as a folk god, a folk religion spirit. But any number of popular religious temples in China today, which have images of Buddhist and Taoist gods and notables, now include images of Mao Zedong. He has become part, it is not a question of making Mao a god. He was a god in the Cultural Revolution, but now he is one amongst many gods in a folk religion that long precedes and will likely long survive not only communism, but democracy and other forms of political development. In that sense, Mao has found his long-term home in Chinese culture, in the pantheon of popular religion. Finally, a note on personal Maos. Each of these other Maos that I have suggested in contemporary China are social Maos, social groups, how they use Mao. But underneath and cross-cutting all of these are hundreds of millions of people's personal experiences with Mao. These are not necessarily people who met Mao or studied Mao significantly, and I'll give two examples, one from the elite and one from more ordinary people. Beginning with the more ordinary, the parents of a colleague of mine at a major university in Shanghai are farming people from an interior province. This professor studies ancient Greece and has studied in the West, and is a very sound and active modern academic. But he goes home and he's critical of the faults and limitations of politics and life in China today. But when he goes home to see his parents, who are still alive, they have pictures of Mao up in their house, which is now a prosperous house in the countryside, and they say with conviction that we are grateful to Mao today. He saved working farmers such as ourselves. That's what they believe, and they're not alone in believing it. At the other end of the social scale, a professor in Beijing, I know, was actually president of one of the universities there, one of the smaller universities, and a high cadre in the Communist Party of the older generation, who frequently in the 90s berate me about the limitations of reform China. This older party leader who had studied in France, had been in the base areas during the war, and had served loyally to the Communist Party in the educational arena, frankly told me Deng Xiaoping is a revisionist. Mao was right. Deng Xiaoping has gone back on communism and gone for capitalism. Jiang Zemin, Deng Xiaoping's successor, doesn't even rate with this fellow. He just thinks he's disgusting. So here's a senior party cadre who believes that what the reform China has brought on is wrong, that it's capitalism and that it's bad. And he remembers the old days fondly. But I'll have to say that his closing comment was, you know, it was much better under Mao. Nobody ever stole my bicycle. In the last 2 years, my bicycle has been stolen twice. As a member of the elite, he did well under the Mao period, but to be fair, is doing well under the new period, but does not find that it's up to his personal memory of what Mao led him to do. It has been my hope in this lecture to give a sense of the multiple meanings of Mao in Chinese history and in China today. Roderick McBarker at Harvard, one of the scholars who has focused on Mao's political career, particularly in the origins of the Cultural Revolution, has long said that Mao was both the Lenin and the Stalin of the Chinese Revolution, and as a way to capture the good and the bad. What I have seen is that if we look at the continuing influence of Mao's ideology and thinking in terms of making revolution and restructuring Chinese society in the modern world, Mao's contribution, that we have not reviewed that in detail here, arguably is more substantial on the theory level than saying he was like Lenin. On the other end, Mao's crimes, he is fully responsible for those millions of deaths in the Great Leap Forward, in the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, can only bring to mind Pol Pot and the terrible Khmer Rouge regime. So a way to capture the multiple Maos of China and to capture the inconvenient truth of his multiple personalities, if you like, is to say that Mao was the Marx, the Lenin, the Stalin, and the Pol Pot of the Chinese Revolution. Thank you.